Welcome to the Mental Health Podcast. I'm Tim, and I invite you to join me on my journey to talk about men's mental health. Before we begin, as always, a brief disclaimer. I am not a mental health professional in any shape or form. I'm just a dude who wants to talk about men's mental health and get other people to talk about men's mental health as well. This week, I would like to talk about the possible link, spoiler alert, there is one, between income, financial stability, or poverty, and depression or mental health. To start off this episode, I would like to read out a quote which I found very telling. In recent years, the death of successful entertainers showed that the rich and famous are not impervious to mental health problems. Mental illness played a role in the death of Robin Williams, Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain, and Chester Bennington. All of them were adored by countless fans, or were millionaires, or were depressed. However, mental illness is more closely associated with poverty. Yet, when poor people experience depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or a range of other mental health disorders, these individuals do not make headlines. They simply become a statistic. And it has been highly debated whether or not there is a link between poverty and mental health, because it is sought to believe that, as we've just heard, rich people suffer from mental health issues as well. So why would being poor make it more if the rich suffer from it as well? So obviously, being rich, being famous, does not stop you from being depressed. So it must be something else. It can't be to do with money. But that is a false herring, because yes, being rich and famous does not save you from feeling or from being depressed, having depression, having anxiety, having PTSD, and any other range of mental health issues. But being rich or wealthy or even affluent allows you a much easier access to help, to support, and also allows you to take time off work. Whereas if you're poor, that's not really the case. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But there have been studies that show that people that live in poverty or close to the poverty line are affected 1.5 to 3 times more often, or more likely to be affected by mental health issues, most commonly depression and anxiety. So just by being poor, not only do they have less access to help, but they're also more likely to suffer from mental health issues and depression. And according to a Gallup poll, depression disproportionately affects people in poverty. The 2011 poll found that about 31% of individuals who are living in poverty and 15.8% of those not in poverty reported having been diagnosed with depression. And there's not really a understanding of why that is, because sometimes being poor leads to depression, and sometimes depression leads to being poor. For example, you are poor and you develop depression. For some reason, for example, some people argue that if you're born into poverty, due to the lack of nutrients, lack of care, lack of prenatal care, and all of these things lead to a underdevelopment of certain areas in your brain, which are more likely to cause depression later on in life or anxiety. On the other hand, if you are not poor from the beginning, whatever that means, but if you develop depression in your life, that can lead to you losing your job, losing financial security, you losing social stability as well, which is a form of wealth, and can then exacerbate the symptoms because let's be honest, being poor by itself already is stressful, very, very, very stressful. And yet there's this whole belief money doesn't, bring happiness, which is mostly said by people who have money for some reason. And having a mental illness on top of that, I don't know, I don't think you need to be a scientist to understand how that can add a lot more pressure and a lot more stress. Now, why is it then that people that live in poverty or near the poverty line are more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses? It is a highly discussed debate. Most of the evidence, I would say, as far as I could find, the majority of the evidence shows that there is not just a correlated link, so the numbers, the being closer to the poverty line, or being poor, and having depression, they don't just happen to be together. For example, if something just correlates, if you eat a lot of spaghetti and win the lottery at the same time, like you change your diet and you start eating a lot of spaghetti and you win the lottery at the same time, just because these things happen at the same time doesn't mean they're related. Very unlikely that the increased eating of spaghetti has led to you winning the lottery. But that in fact it is a causal link. So you eat a lot of spaghetti and all of a sudden they throw you out of Italy. That is actually the case. So being poor leads to having being more susceptible to developing depression or anxiety. And one of the contributing factors that people have, or that studies have researched and shown, is that being poor and living beneath or near the poverty line does actually impair your cognitive functions, which does not mean that poor people are in any shape or form less intelligent or less able to, live, like understand things, but it can lead, because just if you're not living near the poverty line and never have in your life, it might be very difficult to understand the feeling of having to worry about money the entire time, having nothing on your mind but how do I pay the next bill? What do I do if I have to buy food for my family and the brake on my car doesn't work anymore, but I need to get this to work. Without my car, I can't get any money, but without any money, I can't feed my family. But if I use the money to pay for my car, I can't feed my family anyways. Having that on your mind the entire time and having to work every month for barely surviving, and sometimes not even that, but actually accumulating debt while working, maybe sometimes more than one job, can be so incredibly stressful on your mind that you actually start making bad decisions just because your brain can't handle all of it anymore. You're constantly worried. There's a constant stress on you. And then you start making bad decisions. And your brain is so stressed out and about survival and the stigma that comes with it, it can silly do anything else. And now, interestingly, which is something that people in certain political spectrums and in certain above a certain income will tell you is not true, is as soon as people get cash money, just randomly get money. So there's a transfer, like a cash transfer program where people get a certain amount of money extra on top just to, cover some of the expenses. Things change. Suddenly, all of a sudden, they can focus more on being, helping their family better, making better choices, making more long-term decisions, because the brain is no longer preoccupied by this constant terror constant stress, constant fear of how you survive for the next few days, weeks, or months, how you feed people that depend on you, and you are the person also that depends on you, and how the next big bill will not break your neck. As soon as that happens, not only do people start making better decisions, but the rates of depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses start to go down. So maybe next time someone tells you that, poor people just need to pull themselves up on the bootstrings. I should probably learn idioms before I start using them. Anyways, next time someone tells you that, make them think about it a bit more. Because another interesting thing is, for a long time, the medical community, psychologists and sociologists, social studies, basically a lot of the Western world believed that ideas, or not ideas, sorry, not ideas, definitely not ideas, diseases and conditions such as depression and anxiety affect only the Western world, the modern world, the highly developed world, and other countries, like poor countries, do not experience it, or experience it a lot less. And if they experience this, it is usually only due to social injustice, due to like colonialism. If you're British, you probably didn't learn this in school, but you colonized quite a bit of the world and traumatized a lot of people when you did that. And that's coming from a German who did, my ancestors did a lot of horrible shit, but maybe you should brush up on your history. Anyways, so for a lot of years, they believed that if there was a person or a group of people in a poorer country suffering from depression, then that was mostly due to social injustice and not due to their poverty, because poverty does not lead to depression. Well, turns out, and check out the Guardian article I've posted in the show notes, that is actually not true. That the people in poorer countries that are poor also suffer a lot from depression and anxiety, and not just due to colonialism or social injustices, but just because they're poor, because they have to suffer the extreme stress of being poor, just as we in the Western world have. And it is a human condition. It is something that we suffer from if the surroundings benefit the development of that. Of course, if society then tells you that your single job, your only purpose in life, the one thing you're supposed to do is to provide for your family, to put food on the table, to make not only ends meet, but to, make it, to become something, to make something out of your life, to be the successful world conqueror, more or less, then this idea, not this, why do I keep saying idea? Then this situation where if you don't make it, if you are living near the poverty line, and the more you grind and the more you work, it just doesn't work, because let's not get too much into it, but there are some systemic barriers involved that stop people that living in poverty from making it out of that poverty. If you're interested in that, I can talk about that too. Just drop me a message if that's an episode you're interested in. But yes, then you don't make it out of the poverty, and you feel like a complete and utter failure as the man. And I keep forgetting that I can see myself on this camera, but the people listening at home or as on their podcasting app cannot actually see me, because I've made quite a few quotation marks around words that now came across as if I've actually meant them. I'm sorry, I made, obviously not the man, there were quotation marks around it. And modern world, as in countries in the West are more modern than others, also were quotation marks, just like, yeah. Just so you know, sorry. I try to keep that in mind. Just because I can see myself doesn't mean you can see me necessarily. So if that is your entire purpose in life, according to society, and here quotation marks again, you are supposed to be the man, then if you fail, that exacerbates the possibility of you developing a form of anxiety or depression. And then you're poor, which even exacerbates that more. And then you're not allowed to talk about it. And if you want to hear more about that, go back to episode 7, where I talk more about how and why men are not encouraged to talk about their feelings. Then that makes it worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So that needs to change. And we can't change some things, but we can change other things. But before I go into that, let's talk about me. Because, like I said, in the first 10 episodes of this podcast, I will be talking about me and my own journey and how these topics have affected me. So I was very poor for a big chunk of my life. If I didn't have, because of the poorness I was in, a lot of student debt and other debt, I would now no longer be considered poor because I have a job and I have a good income, and I live in Germany. I live in a nice flat. I have heating, I have food, I'm not poor. Just fact, I'm not poor. But when I grew up, for the first few years of my life, my mom was always, not always, but for the majority of my life, was a single mom who brought up me and my siblings by herself. And at the beginning of my life, the beginning of Tim's life, the monumental journey, we were well off. We lived in Eastern Germany. My mum worked for the government, and we had an okay. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor. We were, like in England, you would call us middle class. And then my mum met my brother's father, whom she married, and then due to some complications from birth and the marriage falling apart, our social ladder went down. We went down on the social ladder. We became a family. My mother developed some mental health problems and couldn't go to work for many, many years, and we started living off the dough of government money, which wasn't much, which wasn't a lot. And we moved a lot. It was difficult to make ends meet. The food was important because it was the only thing we had. That's why I have a very difficult relationship to food, something I'll talk about in another episode at some point, probably. But but the food itself was always like thinner at the end of the month, which is a theme that has accompanied me for all of my life. And because my mom had mental health problems, but we were poor, so she couldn't get help. And then we couldn't get out of it. And it took more than 10 years for her to make it out of the Doe family life. By that time, I had moved out. I moved out when I was 17 for various reasons, and lived by myself then. And then I lived with a roommate who stole money from me, the little money I had. And from the moment I turned 17 until very recently, when I was 31 and had my first real paying job, my life was hustling, was how do I make it to the next month? How do I, at the end of the month, and sometimes even already in the middle of the month, how do I pay for my next meal? So at the end of the month, how do I get my next meal? Sometimes even already at the middle of the month, how do I get my next meal? And which I find really interesting and very telling, that not only when I was 17 it started, but when at 17 it wasn't as big of a problem as it was in my late 20s, even though I made a bit more money, but everything else just had become so much more expensive. So even though I started to make a bit more money because I, had a degree and I started working more paying jobs, but always until 1st of January 2021, all my jobs were gig jobs. They were always either 0-hour contracts where if you don't work, you don't get paid, or they're only short-term contracts. That was my life from when I was 17, even earlier, because when I was 16, I started delivering newspapers. But from that point up until I was 31, yeah, all I had were jobs where if I didn't work, I didn't have any money. And from when I was 17 until I was 31. So basically, almost half my life. And if you've followed my journey so far, you know that from when I was 17 and started my mental health problems, and when I was 31, no, when I was 29, that was the time where I just couldn't not get help anymore. But before that, I couldn't be ill most of the time. I think from when I was 25 until I was 31. No, until I was 29. Sorry. So for 4 years, I had no sick days. Not one. Not a single one. I was ill, obviously, but I never took time off work because I couldn't afford it. And the time where I took off work when I was 29 was because I just couldn't not, like I couldn't go to work. I was physically incapable of going to work, not because I wanted to. And still to this day, it is in my head, even though I could theoretically, because in Germany we don't have this thing that some Americans, as far as I know, have, where you only have certain sick days per year allowed. No, in Germany you can just be ill if you're ill. If you have a job that where you're full-time employed. Yeah, even though I have that now, I still never really not go to work when I'm ill because that's just in my head. I have to work. I cannot take time off to look after myself physically and mentally. And that's just, excuse my language, that's fucked up. And it's so many people on this planet that have to live that way, that cannot look after themselves because if they stop working, they don't eat, they don't have a roof over their head, they don't have any warmth, they don't have any transportation, and most of the time, people that depend on them don't have any of those things either. That is the world we've created. Isn't that great? Um, and yeah, I was even very, very lucky, incredibly lucky, and I am grateful and I know of my privilege living in Germany, where when I was 29 and I needed the help, I could get it because I was insured, even though I had to pay for my insurance by myself because of the way the insurance system works. If you study, you have to pay for your own insurance, which you then have to work for to make that money. Um, Anyways, it wasn't super bad, but still weird. But the payment of the insurance was still cheaper than the therapy I got, so I didn't have to pay for my therapy because of the insurance system that we have in Germany, and I am so grateful, and I cannot understand how any country can do it differently. Because even in Germany, it's difficult to get therapy. In Germany, it's not easy, but it is still a hell of a lot easier than in other countries. Yeah. Anyways, where was I? Yeah, so I did get the help when I needed it. Now, some people might wonder, because I have a degree, I have a master's degree even, so I am obviously on that front, supposedly a highly educated, highly trained person that is employable. How come I was poor for so long? Well, for one, my mental health issues stopped me from finishing my degree earlier. For another, because I didn't have any financial help, I did have a little bit of government aid when I did my bachelor's degree, which just about paid my rent. Everything else I needed to work for. I was grateful for that because knowing that your rent is paid is such a relief, which didn't happen anymore once I did my master's degree. Because the government then decided, well, no, you don't need any help anymore, pay for your own shit. So I didn't have anyone pay my rent. I needed to work for that, and I needed to work for any food. And because I had to work for the majority of my master's, I had 3 jobs simultaneously. So I had to work a lot, and because I had to work a lot, I couldn't do my focus on my degree. So my degree took longer. So I had to just work longer. And in the end, because of my declining mental health and my um, inability to make enough money pay for all my expenses, because once you become older, the insurance gets more expensive, the rents increase, the food prices went up. Um, I had to take out a student loan. And because I was not in a very good place, I took out a very stupid student loan, which means I now have to pay back way more than I ever got out and help. So that was good. That's great. So now I'm paying off a huge student loan. So even though I have a full-time job now, I'm still not financially super well off. I'm still better off. So I don't want to say that I'm not good off. Anyways, so that's one part where the poverty did make my mental health worse. Another aspect is, as I've discussed in the last episode, something that really, really helps with mental health is social interaction, social communities. Talking to other people, sharing experience with other people, being seen and heard by other people, feeling a sense of community is the so-called apple a day for your mental health. If you're poor and your friends aren't, then you are alone, because you cannot participate in a lot of the events that they want to participate in. At the beginning of my studies, that wasn't as big of a problem because most students are poor, even if they've backed up by their parents. It's not like at least not in my community, it was such a big difference. But the older I become, the more money they started to make, the more they could do things that I couldn't do. And that continues to this day, because most of my friends make a hell of a lot more money than me, for various reasons, and they start to do more and more things that I cannot follow them. And it makes lonely, because you see them being able to do these things and you can't join them, and they then have shared experiences that you cannot share with, and you just, on the one hand, you feel left behind, and on the other hand, you also feel less connected to them, because you just don't experience things. That's just on the experiences that you have together level. There's also, if you grew up poor and they didn't, and I mean by growing up poor, not by not growing up poor, not being like living in mansions and stuff, but having a house, not having to worry about money with your family, never having to discuss money, going on holidays quite often, more than once a year. I mean, for most of my life, I didn't go on any holidays. And going skiing, for some reason, I find friends that went skiing when they were young definitely grew up a hell of a lot different than I did, because there was never an idea in my mind going skiing. Anyways, they have experience that you didn't have, that I didn't have. For a big chunk of my life, I couldn't just leisurely learn and read and experience things because I had to work or worry about work. Worrying, as people with anxiety and other mental illnesses will know, worrying takes up so much mental capacity that you can't do other things anymore. It just takes up too much space. And that's then experiences that from the get-go you don't share, you don't have together. And alongside this, that you can't do things with your friends, it's not just that you can't do things with your friends, it's in general, when you suffer from depression, anxiety, and mental illness, there are things to alleviate them. There's doing exercise, there's doing leisure activities, there's changing your surroundings. But when you're poor, it's very difficult to be able to do those things, because on the one hand, you need to work a lot to be able to afford your life. On the other hand, the little money you make, you can not quite easily spend on going somewhere, especially if the public transport is very expensive, which it is in Germany and other countries, or if things are not free to go to, which is something that the UK does great. I love the UK for the fact that museums are free of charge. That is, UK, you're doing great there. Germany and other countries, what the fuck's wrong with you? Sorry for the for the fuck word. so you can't go there, so you can't alleviate the depression, so it just becomes worse again. Another factor where the poverty plays a part. And then while you feel isolated and you can't do the things with your friends, and you feel and you can't do anything to alleviate the depression because of the stigma that comes along with both wealth and poverty. If you're wealthy, you are someone that's made it, you are someone in society that's seen as valuable. Whereas if you're poor, you're not. Because let's be honest here, there is a hell of a lot more poor people in this world than rich. There's a big chunk of people that are, have a normal, perfect life, but there's a very few billionaires who, make headline news almost every day. You can basically put them all in a big house, and there's a billion of poor people that we never see on the news, or very rarely, and we don't care. Because we don't care about poor people, we care about rich people. And that's something that you live with if you're poor. You live with the knowledge that nobody cares. Remember my opening quote. So I hope this episode has shown to the people that have not grown up in poverty or near the poverty line that poverty affects depression a lot. And I hope that the people that are suffering or struggling a lot from financial problems see that you're not alone. It doesn't make the problems go away, but it might help with the feeling of alone and of the stigma, because mental health and illness are difficult to deal with for anyone, poor or rich. They're difficult, but it is a hell of a lot more difficult when you're poor, because you don't have access to resources, and all the other things I've talked about in this episode just play against you. And yeah, something cheap we can do if all of the other areas are not available to you, either due to financial or social situations you find yourself in, is to talk about our problems with our loved ones, with friends, with family, with strangers like me. If there's nobody else, you can talk to me. There is ample possibilities in the show notes and on the in the comment below, and on the website men-tell-health.com. You find an anonymous contact form or a non-anonymous contact form where you can share whatever you wish with me. You can message me via email, tim@men-tell-health.com, or connect with me on Instagram or YouTube. This is it for this week. And as always, I would be grateful if you would rate this podcast on YouTube. Give it a like, give it a subscribe, and maybe give it the bell. People say that, so do that. Apple Podcast and any other podcasting app where you can rate the podcast. It is incredibly helpful to be seen, to have more people, give more people access to this podcast, to this resource. And yeah, share it with your friends and family. And remember, I see you and I hear you, and I hope you see and or hear me again next week. Goodbye.